The island had never been seen before, and its secrets were waiting to change everything. Captain Morgan Blackheart Connolly stood at the helm of his ship, the Sea Fury, squinting through the thick mist that clung to the horizon. His weathered face, tanned from years of battling the sun and salt water, was now locked in a state of disbelief. There, ahead of him, where no land should be, was an island that appeared on no map. It was as if the earth itself had decided to hide it from the world. The only sound was the soft creak of the ship's wooden boards and the distant crash of waves against the unseen shore. "Is this some kind of joke?" Captain Connolly muttered under his breath, his voice hoarse from too many nights of shouting orders. His piercing blue eyes narrowed as he looked again, just to be sure. The island stood out against the gray backdrop like a forgotten memory, its jagged cliffs rising high above the water, while thick forests seemed to swirl with shadows. It beckoned him, pulling at his very soul. "Look at it! It's impossible," he bellowed, his voice suddenly rising in a mix of excitement and disbelief. "This island, this place, it's not on any map. How is that possible?" The crew of the Sea Fury stood in stunned silence. They had been with him through countless adventures, through storms and battles, but none of them had ever seen their captain so shaken. "Captain," said the first mate, a large, hulking man named Bartholomew, his voice deep with suspicion. "Are you sure this be a good idea? It looks cursed, not a place for men, if you ask me." The captain scowled, his dark brows furrowing. "You doubt me, Bartholomew? This could be the greatest discovery of our time. There's treasure here, I can feel it. And what better than to claim it for ourselves, eh?" He waved his hand grandly toward the mysterious island, his voice growing more passionate. "No one else has ever set foot here. Do you know what that means? This place holds secrets, secrets that could change everything for us." Morgan Connolly was a man driven by the thrill of discovery, and above all, the allure of treasure. His reputation as a pirate captain was built on decades of ruthless raids, cunning strategies, and an unyielding desire to claim what others thought was out of reach. He had no love for kings or governments, his allegiance was only to the treasure that lay hidden in the corners of the world. And now, with this strange island before him, he was certain he was on the verge of finding the ultimate prize. As he stared at the island, a strange thrill coursed through his veins. His mind raced with possibilities. What could it be? An ancient civilization? A hidden vault of gold? The very thought made his heart beat faster. But there was something else, something that gnawed at the back of his mind, a feeling, a whispering doubt. Was the island a trap? Was there danger waiting for him, just beyond the mist? He shook his head, trying to shake off the unease. There was no time for second guessing. "Prepare to drop anchor," he ordered with authority, his voice now firm and commanding. The crew quickly scrambled into action, setting the sails and securing the ship. The air seemed thick with tension as they drew closer to the shore, and yet, excitement buzzed among the men. There was no denying that they all felt it, the pull of the unknown. This was not just any island, this was their island now. Or so they thought. Captain Connolly was not a man to shy away from risk. The rugged pirate captain had risen from nothing, an orphan child washed ashore after a shipwreck, raised by the tides and winds of the vast oceans. He had learned the ways of the sea as a boy, a mere deckhand before he grew into the feared and respected leader of a notorious pirate crew. His past was one of blood, betrayal, and hard-earned victories. Nothing had ever been able to keep him down. Not a brutal storm. Not the king's navy. And certainly not superstition or fear. Yet, as the anchor dropped into the water, and the ship groaned under the weight, something about this island felt different. His men could sense it too, although none dared speak of it out loud. Instead, they exchanged uneasy glances as they disembarked. The boat rocked violently as they made their way to the beach, but it was not the waves that made their hearts race. It was the island itself. The air felt thick, charged with a strange energy, as if the land itself was alive. As the crew stepped onto the shore, the dense jungle loomed ahead. Thick vines snaked up ancient trees, their roots twisting out of the earth like the fingers of long-forgotten gods. It was a place untouched by time, its silence broken only by the distant cry of an unseen bird and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The sky overhead was gray and heavy, as though it too was watching, waiting. "Captain, what now?" Bartholomew asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Connolly turned to face his first mate, his eyes burning with determination. "We explore. We find the treasure. And we take it." He paused for a moment, his lips curling into a grin that was as dangerous as it was confident. "This island will be ours." But as the words left his mouth, a shiver ran down his spine. He could feel it now, the island was not as welcoming as it first seemed. There was something hidden here, something ancient. He didn't know what it was yet, but he was certain it would change everything. Could this be the place he had spent his life searching for? Or was it something far darker? There were no answers yet, only the promise of discovery. The setting was one of mystery and danger. It was the 1700s, the age of exploration, and the vast oceans were filled with stories of strange lands and lost treasures. But nothing like this had ever been seen before. The island, uncharted and unknown, lay at the edge of the world, untouched by the hands of men. And Captain Connolly was about to unravel its secrets. But as he stepped forward, the jungle before him seemed to whisper. The trees bent as if bowing to some unseen power. And in the distance, there was the faintest echo of something far older than the pirate captain himself. The island's secrets were waiting. But would they be the treasures of legends, or would they be the end of Captain Morgan Connolly? The dense jungle loomed around Captain Morgan Connolly and his crew like a dark, breathing entity, its thick trees and tangled vines stretching high above them. With each step they took on the path leading deeper into the island, the air grew heavier. The tropical heat clung to their skin, the sweat dripping from their brows as they moved cautiously through the undergrowth. "Keep close, lads," Captain Connolly barked, his voice harsh, cutting through the oppressive silence. He felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. This island, so strange and untamed, was like nothing he had ever encountered. He could almost hear the island's secrets calling to him, taunting him with their mystery. But just as his mind raced with the possibilities, a sharp cry pierced the air. The captain froze, his blood running cold. It was not the cry of an animal, it was the sound of a human voice. A voice, desperate and full of pain. "Did you hear that?" Bartholomew whispered, his massive frame tensing beside Connolly. The captain's heart began to race, a mix of excitement and suspicion building within him. "It came from that way," he muttered, pointing toward the darkening forest. A flicker of doubt crossed Bartholomew's face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "Should we go after it, Captain?" he asked, his voice low. Captain Connolly's eyes narrowed as he listened again. The sound had come from deep within the jungle, almost like a plea for help, but there was something strange about it. The island had already unsettled him, and now this cry, it felt like the first warning of a danger they couldn't yet understand. Still, he could not resist. The promise of treasure, and now the possibility of another soul stranded on this forsaken island, urged him forward. "We go," he ordered sharply. "We may not be alone here." The crew hesitated for a moment but followed behind their captain as he forged ahead. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the thick, damp earth beneath them. The jungle was alive with unseen creatures, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, the occasional crack of a branch snapping underfoot, but the path ahead seemed eerily silent. As they pushed forward, the jungle grew denser. The trees closed in, blocking the sunlight, casting everything in a greenish twilight. The air grew thick with humidity, each breath like a gulp of warm water. Despite the sweltering heat, Connolly's heart was pounding with anticipation. Then, the cry came again, this time, closer. "Help! Someone, please! Help me!" It was a man's voice, strained and desperate, filled with raw fear. The captain quickened his pace, motioning for his crew to follow. There was something about the voice that sent a chill down his spine. Finally, they reached a small clearing where the trees opened up. In the middle of the clearing, collapsed against a massive rock, was a man, dressed in tattered clothes, his hair wild and unkempt. He looked like he hadn't seen civilization in years, his face gaunt, eyes sunken. His skin was pale, as if he hadn't seen the sun in far too long. Who are you?" Captain Connolly demanded, his voice laced with suspicion but tinged with concern. His eyes darted around, half expecting some kind of trap. The man looked like a castaway, but how had he ended up here? And why had he called for help? The man's eyes flickered up, locking with Connolly's for a brief moment before he coughed, a hacking sound that seemed to rattle his entire frame. No time. The man's voice was weak, barely a whisper, but his words sent a wave of unease through Connolly. "The island, it's cursed, you have to leave, now." Captain Connolly's grip tightened around his cutlass, his thoughts racing. A cursed island? This was madness. Was the man delirious from hunger and thirst, or was there truth in his words? "Cursed?" Bartholomew repeated, taking a step forward. "What are you talking about, mate?" The man looked up, his eyes wild and frantic. "The treasure, it's not what you think." He stopped abruptly, his eyes darting to the trees around them. Then, without warning, he pushed himself to his feet with surprising strength, stumbling backward. "They're here! They've found us!" His voice was a frantic whisper, barely audible over the rising wind that suddenly stirred the leaves. "What's he talking about?" Bartholomew growled, eyes narrowing. But before anyone could respond, the jungle seemed to come alive around them. A loud rustling noise echoed through the trees, and then a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. Another man, clad in torn clothing, eyes wide with madness, emerged from the shadows. His skin was pale, and his face twisted in a grotesque expression of fear. "No! No!" the second man shouted, his voice trembling. "You don't understand. The island—" He was cut off by a sudden, eerie wail, a noise that seemed to come from every direction at once. "Get to the ship!" Connolly shouted, his instincts kicking in. The pirate captain turned, motioning for his crew to retreat. This was madness. What kind of island was this, and what was it that made these men so afraid? But the moment they started to move, the ground beneath them trembled. It was a subtle vibration at first, but then it grew stronger, like the very earth was waking up. The trees around them groaned, and the air seemed to crackle with a strange energy. "Run!" the first castaway screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "Get off the island! Before it's too late!" He pushed himself forward, grabbing Connolly by the arm with a strength that sent a jolt of fear through the captain. The crew exchanged anxious glances, but it was too late. The ground shook harder now, the trees swaying violently as though caught in a storm. And from the depths of the jungle, strange shapes began to emerge, figures that moved with unnatural speed, their forms distorted and shadowed by the thick foliage. "By the gods, what are those?" Bartholomew shouted, his eyes wide with disbelief. Captain Connolly drew his cutlass, his knuckles white with tension. The tension in the air was suffocating, the jungle closing in on them. Whatever was happening, they were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. The inciting incident had shattered the calm that once hung over the pirate crew. The treasure they had come for now seemed insignificant in the face of the dangers lurking on this mysterious island. Connolly could feel the tension building, the desperate need to escape, and yet, a part of him, that deep-seated hunger for the unknown, urged him to stay and find the answers, whatever they might cost. This was no ordinary island. And the treasure that awaited them might just be far more than gold or jewels. The real question now was, could they survive long enough to uncover the truth? The forest trembled as the figures from the jungle closed in. Captain Connolly's heart pounded in his chest as the terror-stricken man who had warned them of the island's dangers shrieked in panic. The ground beneath their feet quivered, and the sky above seemed to darken. It was as though the island itself was alive, and it was angry. "To the ship! Move, now!" Connolly barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. His crew scrambled, their boots pounding the earth as they hastily retreated from the encroaching darkness. Bartholomew, who had been eyeing the jungle with suspicion since they arrived, muttered, "This island, it's cursed, Captain." "I knew it." But Connolly didn't have time to consider the weight of those words. There was no room for doubt now. The island wasn't just hiding treasure, it was guarding something far more dangerous, something far darker. He was certain of it. A sharp cry came from behind him. One of the crew, a young sailor named Tim, was sprawled on the ground, his leg caught in a snare. His face twisted in pain as the vines tightened around his ankle, dragging him toward the dense jungle. "Help! Help me!" Tim screamed, reaching for Connolly's outstretched hand. Connolly hesitated, his mind racing. The jungle was closing in. Something unseen was lurking just beyond the treeline, and it felt as though the very trees themselves were shifting, watching them. But Tim's screams pierced the tension. Connolly's instincts kicked in. "Bartholomew! Get him out of that trap!" Bartholomew moved quickly, his massive hands slicing through the vines with a knife. But the moment Tim was free, a terrible roar filled the air, deep and guttural, like some great beast had been disturbed from its slumber. "Run!" Connolly shouted again, grabbing Tim by the arm and hauling him up to his feet. They had no choice but to flee. Every second counted. But as they broke through the trees, a massive shadow shot past them with terrifying speed, too fast to be a mere animal. The jungle erupted into chaos. Figures, humanoid but twisted, with wild, unkempt hair and glowing eyes, emerged from the depths of the forest. They were moving with frightening precision, surrounding the crew. These weren't men, these were something else, something ancient. "Stay close!" Connolly ordered, unsheathing his cutlass. His crew was terrified, their breaths coming in short, panicked bursts, but they had no choice but to obey. As they dashed toward the beach, the dark figures followed. There was something unnerving in their movement, an almost supernatural precision. Their eyes never left the crew, and their faces were contorted in expressions of rage and fear. It was clear they didn't want anyone leaving the island. Not alive, anyway. "What the devil are these things?" Bartholomew growled, his voice thick with disgust as he swung his cutlass wildly at the nearest figure. The creature dodged with unnatural speed, hissing in frustration. "They're not human," shouted Tim, his voice hoarse. They're like ghosts." Connolly's mind raced. Were they spirits of the island's original inhabitants? Or something far worse? The treasure, whatever it was, had awakened a force that should have remained buried. And now, they were in its sights. The beach was in sight, but the figures were closing in faster than they could run. The crew was growing desperate, slowing down as they struggled to keep up. The jungle's inhabitants seemed to move with ease, closing the gap. But then, just as Connolly thought all hope was lost, he heard a voice, louder than the screams of the jungle, more determined than anything he had heard in his life. "Get down!" Bartholomew shouted as something whizzed by overhead, an arrow. A warning shot. The crew halted, the sound of the arrow's flight hanging in the air like a heavy silence. The figures in the jungle froze, momentarily distracted. From the treeline, a tall, rugged figure emerged, her silhouette framed against the dimming sky. She was clad in leather, her dark hair pulled back in a tight braid, her expression fierce but focused. A bow was slung over her shoulder, and a quiver of arrows was strapped to her back. "Who are you?" Connolly demanded, raising his cutlass as he looked at the stranger, trying to make sense of the unexpected ally. The woman didn't hesitate. "I'm Zara," she replied, her voice low but strong. "And you're in serious trouble. Those things, the island's guardians, they'll kill you if you don't leave. Now." Zara wasted no time. She spun around and fired another arrow into the jungle, the sharp twang of the bowstring echoing through the trees. Another one of the creatures fell, its eerie shriek filling the air as it crumpled to the ground. "What are they?" Tim gasped, his voice filled with both fear and awe. Ancient protectors, Zara explained quickly, bound to the island long ago. They're the last remnants of the original inhabitants. The treasure you seek, whatever it is, has disturbed something far older than you can imagine. And now, you're all in danger. Captain Connolly's mind was reeling. This woman, Zara, was an ally for now, but could she truly be trusted? And more importantly, what was this treasure that had triggered such a deadly response from the island's guardians? We need to get to the ship, Connolly said, his voice slow and resolute. If we stay here, we die. Zara nodded, her eyes scanning the jungle. Follow me. Stay close, and don't stop running. As they moved, Zara led them through the dense underbrush with incredible speed. Her movements were calculated, each step taking them further away from the creatures in pursuit. The jungle seemed to open up before her like an unspoken path. She knew the island well. For a moment, the crew dared to believe they might escape. But then, another roar, closer this time, echoed behind them. The ground trembled once more, and the jungle came alive with the sound of pursuit. The guardians were relentless. We're not gonna make it. Tim cried, his face pale with terror. Don't stop. Connolly shouted. Keep moving. Zara's sharp eyes caught something in the distance. Through the trees, she spotted the rocky cliffs that led down to the beach. The ship was just beyond the rocks, but it seemed miles away. They were almost there. But as they neared the clearing, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, just as wild as the guardians, but more human. Her skin was painted with strange symbols, and she moved with the same eerie speed. She smiled at Connolly, a chilling grin that sent a shiver down his spine. You think you can escape, she whispered, her voice like the wind. No one leaves this island. In that moment, the stakes couldn't be clearer. Connolly's life, his crew's lives, and the very fate of the treasure depended on whether they could survive the onslaught of the island's terrifying protectors. Keep running. Connolly shouted, his voice fierce with desperation. The journey had just become more dangerous than he had ever anticipated, but there was no turning back now. The crashing waves of the ocean, once a welcoming sight, now felt like the roar of an approaching storm, threatening to pull them under. Captain Morgan Connolly and his crew, weary from their escape through the jungle, pushed forward with every ounce of strength they had left. Behind them, Zara led them through the rocky terrain, her eyes darting to the trees every few moments, her bow ready for anything. The guardians were closing in fast, their distorted faces twisted in fury. Connolly could hear the eerie screeches that echoed through the trees, growing louder with each passing second. The darkness of the jungle seemed to come alive, as if the island itself was closing in on them, surrounding them with its endless dangers. We need to make it to the ship. Connolly shouted, his voice rising over the chaos, his heart pounding with urgency. Zara didn't answer. Her silence was more unnerving than anything else. She was running as fast as they could, but there was no escaping the relentless pursuit of the guardians. Connolly could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the life of his crew hanging by a thread. They were almost there, he could see the ship's silhouette against the dimming sky, but the guardians were closing in too quickly. Tim, gasping for breath, looked back over his shoulder, his face pale with fear. They're not giving up, Captain. We're gonna be cut off. His words sent a chill through Connolly's bones. Zara spun around, her eyes fierce with determination. We can't outrun them. We have to stand and fight. Connolly's instincts screamed at him to keep running, to push for the ship and the safety of its deck. But deep down, he knew she was right. If they didn't face the guardians now, they'd never make it to the ship. The crew would be slaughtered before they ever had a chance to escape. Bartholomew! Get ready! Connolly barked, his hand gripping his cutlass tighter. The massive pirate gave a grim nod, his large frame shifting into a defensive stance as he looked around. The guardians were closing in faster than they could have hoped. There was nowhere to run. They were trapped between the cliffs and the jungle, with only the ocean behind them. Zara, calm and poised, took a deep breath and nocked an arrow, her eyes narrowing with focus. They're coming, she said, her voice low. Make every shot count. The first of the guardians leapt from the trees with a bone-chilling screech. Its face was a grotesque mask of rage, and its limbs moved with unnatural speed. The creature was upon them in an instant, its wild eyes locking with Connolly's. Without hesitation, Connolly swung his cutlass, the steel gleaming in the dying light. The creature dodged with supernatural agility, its claws slashing through the air. It was faster than any human, its movements erratic and impossible to predict. "Stay close!" Connolly shouted, retreating a few paces to give himself room to swing. Bartholomew charged forward, his enormous frame colliding with one of the guardians, sending it stumbling backward. With a roar, Bartholomew swung his axe, knocking the creature back further. The sound of metal meeting bone echoed through the air as the guardian let out a pained cry. But for every one they knocked down, another took its place, emerging from the shadows with renewed fury. The jungle itself seemed to bend and shift, as if the very earth was aiding the guardians in their pursuit. Zara was a blur of motion, her arrows flying with pinpoint precision, each one finding its mark. She didn't pause to celebrate her successes. The guardians were relentless, and her movements were calculated, deliberate, as though she had faced this battle many times before. Connolly gritted his teeth, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The ship was so close, but it felt as though it was miles away. The guardians were too numerous, too fast. If they didn't make a stand now, they'd be overwhelmed. Then, he saw it, a figure, shadowed in the distance, a woman standing on the cliffs above, watching the battle unfold below. Her face was partially obscured by her wild hair, but there was something about her that felt familiar. A surge of recognition hit Connolly like a bolt of lightning. This was the woman who had appeared earlier, the one who had told them they could never leave the island. "You!" Connolly shouted, his voice rising above the noise of the battle. "What do you want from us? What is this place?" The woman's eyes flashed with an unreadable emotion, and she lifted her hands in the air, as though summoning something from the very depths of the earth. The ground shook violently, sending cracks through the rocky terrain beneath them. Connolly barely managed to keep his footing as the earth trembled beneath them. "This island belongs to the guardians," the woman's voice rang out, her tone cold and distant. "You have disturbed what should remain undisturbed. Now, you will pay the price." Her words sent a jolt of fear through Connolly. There was no way they could defeat these guardians if the island itself was turning against them. But he couldn't stop now. His crew was depending on him. "Zara!" Connolly shouted. "Can we defeat her? She's the key to this madness." Zara's eyes darted to the woman on the cliff, her face filled with a mix of recognition and fear. "She's no ordinary enemy. She is the heart of the island. If we defeat her, we might stand a chance, but we'll need to destroy the source of her power." Connolly's heart pounded in his chest. Destroy the source of her power? He had no idea what that meant, but there was no time to question. If they didn't act now, they'd be buried beneath the weight of the island's wrath. "Bartholomew, cover me," Connolly commanded. "Zara, let's take her down." Bartholomew roared, charging into the fray once more, his axe slicing through the air as he fought back the guardians with wild ferocity. Connolly and Zara sprinted toward the cliffs, their hearts racing as the woman watched them from above, her eerie smile growing wider with every step. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and Connolly could feel the energy in the air, electric, charged with a malevolent force. He reached the base of the cliff, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and looked up at the woman. "You can't escape," she hissed, her eyes glowing in the dimming light. Connolly's mind raced. What was this power? What had they awakened? The treasure, the guardians, the island, everything was connected, and only by confronting the source could they hope to survive. Without thinking, Connolly grabbed a nearby rock, his hands trembling as he hurled it at the woman. The impact sent a shockwave through the air, and for a brief moment, the woman faltered, her energy crackling with a violent force. "That's it!" Zara shouted, her eyes widening with realization. "The source! We have to destroy it." Connolly's heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted up the cliffside, his mind focused on the woman. The Guardians were swarming below, but this was the moment of truth. The outcome of everything they had fought for depended on this one decision. With one final, desperate swing of his cutlass, Connolly struck. The woman screamed, the sound deafening, as her power shattered in an explosion of light and sound. The Guardians froze, their unnatural energy dissipating, leaving the jungle eerily silent. Connolly and Zara stood, breathless, amidst the rubble. The battle won. The island fell still. The silence that followed was deafening, but Connolly knew that the worst was over. The treasure, the Guardians, the island's curse, it was all over. For better or worse, they had conquered it. But as they stood there, victorious yet weary, Connolly couldn't help but wonder, had they truly escaped the island's grasp, or was this only the beginning? The dust settled quickly. The jungle, which had only moments ago been alive with the frantic movement of the Guardians and the oppressive energy of the island's curse, was now silent. The air was thick with the aftermath, the tension that had once felt so suffocating slowly dissipating. Connolly's chest heaved as he stood atop the rocky cliff, staring down at the scene below. His eyes locked with Zara's, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the threat of death seemed a distant memory. The Guardians lay still, their grotesque forms frozen in place, their otherworldly energy drained. Connolly could feel the difference in the air, the weight of the island's oppressive grip loosening. The darkness that had loomed over them had been shattered, replaced by a hesitant, fragile peace. Zara was the first to break the silence. Her voice was soft, but the relief in it was undeniable. "We did it. They're gone." Connolly turned to face her, his lips curling into a tired, but genuine smile. "We did it, indeed," he said, his voice hoarse from the chaos. But there was something else in his eyes, something deeper. In that brief moment of victory, he realized how much he had come to rely on her. How much they had both changed since their first encounter on this cursed island. But before they could say anything more, Bartholomew's voice boomed from below, cutting through the calm like thunder. "Captain! We're not out of the woods yet." Connolly's heart skipped a beat. His gaze snapped to the ship. There, docked in the distance, the sea serpent rocked gently in the waves. But something was wrong. The ship's sails, which had been untouched moments before, were now in tatters. The deck was empty, save for the eerie, abandoned silence that clung to it. Connolly's gut twisted. "No. No, this can't be happening," he muttered, clenching his fists. "Is that the ship?" Zara asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Connolly nodded grimly. "It's the sea serpent. But something's not right. The crew. Maybe they're in the jungle, looking for us," Zara suggested, her voice filled with hope. But Connolly shook his head. "No. They wouldn't have left it like that. Something's wrong." He turned on his heel, scanning the area around them. The jungle, though quiet now, still felt alive, too alive. It was as if the very trees were watching them, waiting for their next move. "Bartholomew!" Connolly shouted down to his friend, who was still keeping watch. "Get the crew! We're not leaving yet." The massive pirate grunted in acknowledgement and began descending the cliffside, disappearing into the underbrush. Connolly felt the weight of his decision settle heavily on his shoulders. The island may have been defeated, but the dangers were far from over. What had happened to the rest of his crew? And why had the island's curse not fully lifted? Zara moved closer, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone, you know." Connolly looked at her, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. They had faced the impossible together, and in the aftermath, their bond had grown deeper, more profound. She was no longer just an ally or a stranger, she was someone he could trust with his life. "I know," Connolly said quietly. "But I have to make sure the crew is safe. They've followed me this far. I won't abandon them now." Zara's eyes softened, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. The unspoken understanding between them was enough. The minutes stretched on like hours as Connolly paced, waiting for Bartholomew's return. His mind raced, wondering what kind of danger still lurked on the island. The Guardians were gone, but the ship was in jeopardy. Had someone else arrived? Was there something worse than the Guardians waiting for them? Suddenly, Bartholomew's form appeared from the jungle, his large frame silhouetted against the fading light. His expression was grim, his usually boisterous demeanor replaced by a rare solemnity. "Captain," Bartholomew called out, his voice low. "The crew's gone." Connolly's heart sank. "What do you mean, gone?" "There's no sign of Bartholomew explained. "The ship's been raided. The sails are torn, and the deck's been stripped. There's nothing left but the wreckage." Connolly's mind struggled to process the words. "But who could have done this?" Bartholomew shook his head, his jaw tight. "That's not all. There's something else, something I don't understand. It's the island. It's changing again." Connolly's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Bartholomew took a deep breath before continuing. "The island. It's waking up. The curse isn't just over, it's shifting. I think it wants us to leave. Or it'll swallow us whole." A chill ran down Connolly's spine. The idea that the island was alive, truly alive, was too much to bear. They hadn't defeated it at all. The Guardians had been only one part of the island's defense. The true terror lay beneath the surface, waiting to devour anyone who dared to stay. "Then we need to leave," Connolly said firmly. "Now." Zara nodded in agreement. "We can't stay here any longer. Whatever's left of the crew, they wouldn't want us to fall to whatever this island's become." Connolly took a deep breath, his mind racing. There was only one thing to do now. They had to get to the sea serpent and leave the island behind, no matter what. He turned to Bartholomew. "We're taking the ship, whether it's intact or not. Let's go." Bartholomew's face softened into a relieved grin. "Aye, Captain. It's about time." Together, the three of them moved quickly toward the ship. As they approached, Connolly's heart beat faster. The ship had been damaged, but it was still seaworthy, barely. They could patch the sails, but they had to leave now. The journey to the sea serpent was tense but swift. The island, though seemingly calm, pulsed with a strange energy, as if it was trying to keep them in its grasp. But they were determined. The horizon was within their reach, and the open sea was waiting for them, just beyond the island's rocky shores. As they climbed aboard the sea serpent, Connolly couldn't help but glance back at the island one last time. It loomed over them, dark and silent, its secrets buried deep within. They had survived, but the island had taken its toll. "Let's get out of here," Connolly said, his voice steady. The crew, or what was left of them, set to work repairing the ship. The island, for all its darkness and mystery, was now behind them. The sea serpent creaked to life as the wind filled its sails, pushing them toward freedom. As they sailed into the open ocean, Connolly stood at the helm, Zara by his side. She looked at him, a small, knowing smile on her face. "We made it," she said quietly. "We did," Connolly replied, his voice filled with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. They had overcome the island's curse, its guardians, and the unseen forces that sought to keep them trapped. The world ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Connolly felt ready to face whatever came next. He had survived. They had survived. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, Connolly knew that the greatest treasure they had found wasn't the gold or the riches they had imagined, it was each other, and the unbreakable bond they had forged in the crucible of the island's trials. The journey was far from over. But for now, they were free. The sea serpent glided smoothly through the waves, the vast expanse of the open ocean stretching out before them like an endless canvas. Connolly stood at the helm, his hands steady on the wheel, but his mind was miles away. The chaos, the fear, the endless struggles, they were all behind him now. Yet, even as the island shrank into a distant silhouette, there was an unshakable weight in his chest, a sense that something had changed irrevocably within him. Zara, standing beside him, glanced over at him with a soft smile. Her hair, now wild and windblown, glinted under the last rays of the setting sun. She had been quiet for most of the journey, lost in her thoughts, just as he had been. But now, as the horizon seemed to open up to a world of possibilities, her expression softened, her gaze filled with a quiet understanding. "We did it," she said, her voice a gentle affirmation. Connolly nodded, his eyes never leaving the path ahead. "We did," he echoed. The wind whispered through the sails, carrying with it the scent of salt and freedom. As they sailed away from the cursed island, Connolly could feel the weight of the past lifting, replaced by the promise of something new, something he hadn't dared to hope for before. The island had been a prison, but it had also been a crucible, a trial that had shaped him in ways he hadn't expected. He thought of the crew, the ones who had been lost, and the ones who had stayed. They had all come together to face the impossible, each of them putting aside their fears, their doubts, and their differences. Connolly had once led with only his ambition and his thirst for treasure, but the island had forced him to see beyond that. It had shown him the value of loyalty, of trust, and of the power of the bonds they had forged in the fire of danger. "Where will we go now?" Zara asked, breaking into his reverie. Her question hung in the air between them, a simple one but filled with all the uncertainty of the future. Connolly let out a slow breath, his eyes narrowing as he gazed toward the horizon. "I don't know yet," he admitted, his voice quiet. "But wherever it is, we go together." Zara smiled, her eyes bright. "I like the sound of that." For a moment, there was peace. The ship sailed forward, and Connolly felt a quiet contentment settle over him. The sea serpent was battered, its sails torn, but it was still afloat. And that was enough. They were still alive. The treasure, the island, the curse, it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that they had made it through, and now, they had the world at their feet. Yet, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the last golden rays of light seemed to cast a shadow over Connolly's heart. He glanced over at Zara, who had moved to the edge of the ship, her eyes fixed on the waves as if seeking something more in the distance. "Are you ever going to tell me what it was that you were really looking for on that island?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper, lost in the wind. Connolly chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "I thought I was looking for treasure," he said, turning to face her. "Gold, jewels, all the things I thought would make me happy. But the truth is, I never really knew what I was searching for until now." Zara raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in her gaze. "And what exactly are you searching for now?" Connolly hesitated, the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him. "I think I'm searching for a place where I can belong," he said slowly, his voice steady but vulnerable. "A place where the treasure isn't gold, but the people you trust. The ones you can count on. I'm not sure if I've found it yet, but I'm getting closer." Zara studied him for a long moment, her gaze softening. "I think you've already found it," she said quietly. "It's right here." For the first time, Connolly let the words sink in. He had always been alone, even among his crew. His heart had been consumed by ambition, driven by a hunger for something he couldn't quite name. But now, standing here with Zara, with the sea serpent beneath their feet, he realized the truth. He had never truly been alone. The island had shown him that much. Sometimes, the greatest treasure wasn't something you could hold in your hands, but something you carried in your heart. As the sky darkened and the stars began to flicker above, Connolly found himself feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope for the future, for what was to come, and for the chance to build something new, a life beyond the shadows of his past. The island had taken its toll, but it had also given him the strength to face what lay ahead. The sea serpent sailed on, the wind now at their backs, pushing them toward unknown shores. Connolly wasn't sure where they would end up, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. The sea was wide, and the world was full of endless possibilities. All that mattered now was that he was no longer searching for something, he was living in the moment, with the people who mattered most. The stars above seemed to shimmer brighter as if to mark the end of one journey and the beginning of another. Zara turned to him, her eyes glinting in the moonlight. "So, what's next for us, Captain?" Connolly smiled, his heart lighter than it had ever been. "We sail wherever the wind takes us," he said, his voice full of a quiet resolve. "Together." And so, the sea serpent sailed into the night, the promise of new adventures on the horizon. Connolly knew there would be more challenges ahead, but he also knew that whatever came their way, they would face it together. The treasure he had sought was never about gold, it was about the bonds forged in fire, the courage to face the unknown, and the knowledge that, no matter what, they would never be alone again. The island was gone, its secrets lost to time, but its lessons would stay with them forever. And as the ship cut through the waves, Connolly found peace in the certainty that his journey, his real journey, was only just beginning.